Poverty is not just the absence of money, but the absence of opportunity. And the United States is a country where you have both freedom and abundant opportunities. Moving to the United States has given me both. I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria. I came from a close-knit family. I was the third of four children. And the best thing that my parents gave me was the gift of education. Even though I came from a poor family, they gave me education with the instruction that this is the tool that will help me to dig my way out of poverty and ignorance. But what my parents did was that they instilled in us the value of faith, hard work, and not giving up. They made us realize that if you put in the work, you will definitely get the reward. I came without a dime in my pocket. All I had was big dreams, determination to succeed, and the resilience. I got my first job at the age of 14. My job was on a construction site. My duties were to move concrete on a large pan from one end of the construction site to another one. I worked on that day from around 6 in the morning to about 7 at night. At the end of the day, the employer refused to pay me. And the reason was because she did not authorize the foreman to hire me. So I worked from sunup to sundown and didn't get paid. That tore up my spirit. And from that moment on, I decided that I was going to become a lawyer. And I was going to use every ounce of strength within me to fight against injustice, regardless of how powerful the opponent is. I am a man that worked my way up from nothing. I know what it means to feel like you're being unfairly treated, and I'm the person that can stand up to opponents regardless of how big or how powerful they are. Welcome to another exciting episode of Legal Angle. And we are going to have a celebrated doctor as a guest today. This is a woman who has been practicing medicine for over 30 years, and our resume or CV looks like a book. I'm honored to have Dr. Anita Somani, who is also a candidate for District 11 in Ohio, as guest. Welcome to the show, Dr. Somani.
Thank you so much. And I think you over exaggerated my accomplishments.
Well, you're being modest, but you tell us a little bit more about yourself. Can you tell us more
Yeah.
about?
Um, where do you want me to start?
You can start from anywhere. Who
Uh,
is Dr.
well,
Anita Somani?
um, so my parents came here, similar to your story. My parents came here without any family, without any support system, other than my father was a physician in India, came here to do his PhD. So it was my mom, my dad, and I was 6 months old. I was a baby in their arms. Came to, of all places, Wisconsin, and you know, did his PhD here, went into academic medicine. Fast forward, he within academic medicine, you tend to, go where the teaching opportunities are, where the research opportunities are. So I grew up mainly in Miami, Florida, and then my parents moved up to Ohio. Medical College of Ohio had just been opened up, and so my dad came there as a professor. He was there from 1981 to 1991, and at that point was appointed director of health. He was the first Asian American. So yeah, we have a family of overachievers. So he was the first Asian American in the United States, I believe, to be appointed to a governor's cabinet. So he was part of Governor Voinovich's cabinet. Spent almost 8 years, the two terms that Voinovich had. During that time, I was doing, well, initially I had done medical school in Toledo, came here to Columbus for residency, and got married during med school. So my son was born when I was a second year resident. And that was the sort of impetus to move to Columbus for my parents. partly for my dad's job, but partly for the grandson, the first grandchild. So since residency, I started my own practice. I was a small business owner for 28 years. I managed a practice. We grew the practice into several physicians, nurse practitioners, and then, as you mentioned, COVID hit. 2020 was a difficult year, and we decided at that point, one of my partners had retired, one of them had left. So we had three partners trying to manage a busy OB practice, and stopped doing OB, went to doing strictly GYN and biohealth. Um, it's been a transition. It's, the pros and cons of, owning your own business versus having an employer. So it's an interesting transition right now. But what it did allow me to do was open up the opportunity to run for office. I had not intended to run for office. But again, sometimes when opportunities come your way, you take them. And what happened was, my friend, Representative Beth Liston, had been my representative, but she was, because of the gerrymandering, and you as a lawyer know, there was a ton of gerrymandering that happened in Ohio. There was redistricting that happened. And so because of that, a new district was created, District 11. There's no incumbent. My previous representative, Beth Liston, was no longer my rep. So when I was approached to run for office, I really thought long and hard about it. I only had a weekend to think about it, because I was approached the weekend before the May primary, and the goal was to put a petition together. For those who don't know, you have to have a petition with a minimum of 50 valid signatures to be able to get your name on a ballot to run for office. So once I had talked to my husband, I talked to my kids who are adults and said, "Hey, what do you think?" And, got a lot of positive support. I threw my hat in the ring. I had several friends that pitched in. My husband pitched in, and we ended up getting 125 signatures on the ballot. However, Frank LaRose then said, "Nope, can't be on the ballot. You did not apply to do this in March for the May primary." So that was then a lawsuit that the Democratic Party filed, and 6 of us were in that lawsuit. And eventually the Ohio Supreme Court ruled in our favor and said, "You know what? You did file within the 90 days for the August primary, so we are going to go ahead and let you get your name on the ballot." So that was the journey to getting here. And subsequent to that, I've been very fortunate. I don't have an opponent in the Democratic primary, but I will probably have an opponent in November. So I am learning a whole new skill set. It's very different from practicing medicine. My day job is doing robotic surgery, doing minimally invasive surgery, taking care of women, doing, preventative care, menopause counseling. So that's what I am good at. That's what I know how to do. And now I'm learning about politics. I'm learning how to canvass. I'm learning how to campaign. And it's something that maybe I'll write a book like you did someday.
Maybe.
Yeah.
So you came from a family of doctors. Can
Yeah.
you tell us about your family?
Yeah. My grandfather was a principal of a school in India, and like your family, education was critical to success. It wasn't good enough to just get a bachelor's degree. It was really, really important to get higher education. And I think that's something that America, had such a strong tradition of public education that is slowly being destroyed. And if you think about it, it's part of what we consider racism. If every child has the opportunity for education, then everybody has the opportunity to succeed, to be successful. But when you start chipping away at um, public funding, for public schools, and you start directing that public funding and taxes to charter schools or religious schools or other avenues, it really hurts people who need to have an education where they don't have to pay for that education. Coming from India, I knew from my parents that there were government schools, and then there were British schools that you paid to go to. So again, the people who were wealthy, the people who had money, could go to the British school, quote, British schools. This is now India's independent at this time, but they were able to go to these better, quote, better schools and get higher education and go on to be more successful, whether it was a lawyer or a doctor, whatever they wanted to do. And I'm seeing that slowly happening here, and it worries me. I think that we need to fund education that allows everybody to have that opportunity. So that was part of my parents coming here. Was my dad was able to get his PhD. They emphasized to my brother and sister and I about the importance of higher degrees. So my brother has an MBA. My sister is also an MD. The third generation now, I have a doctor and an engineer. So it's like the perfect Indian family. That's what everybody wants. In India, you can become a doctor or you can become an engineer. And more now we're starting to see lawyers, but that was not a traditional success story in the Indian community. But both my dad is one of four children, and two of he and one of his siblings are physicians. And then those two siblings, my dad has three kids, obviously, including me. And then my, what we call Tauji, or uncle in India, Tauji is Indian for uncle. He has four kids. One was an engineer, and three of them became physicians. And out of that, the next generation, we have several physicians. It's crazy. We could literally open a multi-specialty clinic. So it seems like it's in the blood or in the genes, and we all have that desire to take care of people. My daughter is following in my footsteps, which is amazing. She's known since she was like 8 or 9 years old that she wanted to be a doctor, but often said she was not going to go into obstetrics. She was not going to do gynecology, and here she is doing it. My son, at a young age, was also not going to be a doctor. He knew. He was like, I'm going to be an engineer. I'm going to be a computer scientist or a programmer. And he's become an engineer. It's interesting that despite not directing him in those, and do you have kids? I don't know if you have kids, but you can guide them, you can counsel them, you can advise them, but you can't like tell them what to do in terms of their careers. So it's been interesting to see that they are both super intelligent. They're both very giving, generous people. But my son has always said, "Oh God, no, I could never go into medicine." But my daughter she's incredible. She's doing such a wonderful job.
They come from a family of overachievers.
Yeah.
And, regardless of what they decide to do, they're going to excel at it. Yes.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yes. What made you decide to go into gynecology?
Oh my gosh. It's the story that everybody says. OBGYN is the perfect specialty for somebody who wants to have a long-term relationship with their patients, who wants to be in the hospital, be in the office. You're never tied to one place. That is the beauty of obstetrics and gynecology. I have patients who have been with me since I started in practice, that literally came to me as teenagers and now are in their 40s. So because I've been in practice for 30 years, I've also delivered people that I delivered. So I delivered the mom, and then the daughter grows up and is pregnant, and I end up delivering them. So it's really a wonderful specialty. It's mostly about preventative care. When you think about annual exams, you think about birth control, you think about things that help people to improve their own health. And it allows for surgery. Surgical specialties oftentimes don't have long-term care. Those patients come, they have their surgery, they leave. You don't see them again once you take out their gallbladder or appendix. But for us, doing surgery, that is a patient I've taken care of. Now, our practice is a little different. We do a lot of more focused, minimally invasive surgery, more of the referral base. And so I do have patients that come see me just for surgery and leave, but it's wonderful to have that. And that was what attracted me to OBGYN. I loved medicine. I loved surgery. I couldn't decide like between the two. How do you decide? And then women's health, obstetrics, and gynecology was the perfect mix. It was the perfect match of the two.
Thank you. What does it feel like to provide such multi-generational care?
It's exciting, you get to see three generations. You get to see the mom, the daughter, and then the grandchild. So it's definitely one of those rewarding specialties, a lot of positive feedback. I think there's a lot of burnout in medicine, but people still want to go into OBGYN. It's still a specialty that attracts a lot of people. A lot of med students are super interested. Women's health right now is going through a huge sort of crisis in a way when you think about what happened with the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade. Just to go back in history and talk about it a little bit, it was essentially passed with bipartisan support. It wasn't that only Democrats were interested in passing abortion laws or providing abortion rights at the federal level. It was something that was started by a Republican president, President Nixon. Hey, it's hard to imagine that he did good when you hear all the bad things he did, but he was the one who supported Title X, which allowed families to determine their reproductive decision making. So it was to allow for men to get vasectomies, women to get tubal ligations or permanent sterilization or contraceptive care, whether it was an IUD or birth control, to be able to have those funded at the federal level, to be able to have insurance coverage for those things. Nixon understood that, the economy was successful when people were able to, whether it was women or men or families were able to choose, when they had their children, at what point in their marriage, whether it was early, if it was somebody like me who was starting a career, or someone who was in college and wasn't ready to have a family. So the goal was to allow for family planning. The secondary goal was to allow for women to complete their education. Again, as well as I do, that education is the way to success. So if you don't have the opportunity to control your reproductive decisions, you may get pregnant while you're in high school. You may not be able to then juggle a child and college, or a child, college, and then postgraduate. So those were things that in the early 70s were not considered controversial. And abortion itself was not driven by a religious construct. Catholics believed that life began at quickening, which is typically 18 to 20 weeks when a mom first feels the baby move, so the fetus move. So that was considered when life began. In other religions, abortion is looked upon completely differently. It's part of the Jewish faith that if a mom's life is at risk or a mom's life is threatened, that abortion is legitimately an option. So from a doctor perspective, abortion is medical care. It's part of healthcare. It's no more, no less. It's not political. Does a woman need that for whatever reason? It doesn't matter what the reason is. It's part of what we offer in terms of our full spectrum care. Whether we offer birth control, whether we offer menopausal hormone therapy, but abortion is part of that. And I think the word has become politicized. Abortion covers miscarriage, it covers ectopic pregnancy. It is not specifically what a layperson says it is an abortion. We may classify under elective abortion, but in reality, abortion covers all of those procedures. So going back to the idea of reproductive decision making, when you look at women who have the choice to have an abortion versus those who don't, if you are not able to choose how you live your life and you do get pregnant or you don't have access to contraception when you're a teenager, you're 14 times more likely to end up in poverty. It's very clear that the research is there. The Turnaway study showed that, and that was a study that followed women over a 10-year period. And what they looked at were women that had gone in to have abortions. So whether they were able to successfully have one or not, because of delays or coming in too late, because there is pre-viability or viability in Ohio prior to this new ban, was you could get an abortion up to 20 weeks. So nationally, it varied between 20 and 22 weeks, or even up to 24 weeks. But those abortions that are at that late gestation only comprise 0.1%. It's 0.1% or less are in that gestational age, and most of those pregnancies are wanted, are ones that the family was planning for another child, and then they get a devastating diagnosis that's incompatible with life, or the mother's life is in jeopardy and they're forced to make that decision. So those types of things, also when you think about why did it become such a polarizing issue, it became a polarizing issue because of politics. When you go back and look at history of America, the evangelical, the religious bloc was very reliable about voting, but not always reliable about voting for Republicans. They were pretty much split in terms of Republican and Democrats. So over time, this became a wedge issue that was created by Republican politicians as a way to get that subgroup to then vote for Republicans predominantly. So it's gradually over this 50-year period become a wedge issue. And when you think about, it took 40 years from the time of Reagan to get a Supreme Court that would overturn Roe v. Wade. So I do think that when you think about other rights to privacy, rights like contraception, rights to marry who you choose to marry, whether it's interracial marriage or LGBTQ plus marriages, that right to choose your partner is at risk. The right to contraception is at risk. And the number one way you reduce abortions is not through banning abortions. The number one way is to provide free access to contraception. When you look at states like Colorado, when you look at even with the ACA or Obamacare, the abortion rate steadily went down because we were able to provide free abortion care, or free contraception. And that is the number one way. So if you are on this political, divide and you're thinking about what can I do? Well, not providing contraception is not the way to reduce abortions. And most of the politicians that are out there are saying, okay, we don't want you to get abortions, but we also don't want you to get birth control. And that makes no sense at all. So I do think that's something that we really need to be aware of and start to look at electing politicians, getting Congress to pass laws that will codify those rights, that will make it a federal right to access contraception, a federal right to be able to marry whoever you choose to marry. The right to abortion has become so politicized, but the interesting thing is that it may lead to those other rights becoming federal laws because those are easier. There's much, there's not as much controversy. I mean, most people support abortion. But where it breaks down is how many weeks should it be legal, or at what point of gestation, what point in viability does it become legal or illegal to have an abortion? But whether it's gay marriage or interracial marriage or contraception, those rights, some studies will say 70 to 80% support all of those rights. So it's going to hopefully be easier to get that, but again, when you have a party that is literally trying to obstruct anything positive for the majority of people, it becomes harder. It's so much about not working for the majority of the community, but obstructing good policy. And that's something that I think as a physician, I understand science. I understand, making policy or healthcare policy based on science, based on good data. And that's what it should be about. I mean, I talk about this all the time, like healthcare and having a baby or choosing to have an abortion or getting cancer care, which could be impacted by Roe v. Wade also when you consider medications that are used for medical management of abortions are also used for arthritis and for autoimmune conditions like lupus. So that may come under, under threat of having those patients not be able to access care. So I think that, those issues of healthcare are not red or blue. They are issues that impact everybody in our community. Whether you're a Republican, whether you're a Democrat, whether you're independent, you will need healthcare at some point in your life, right? I mean, that's just a given. Whether it's preventative care, whether it's care for diabetes, care for your blood pressure, for cancer, you're going to need care. So those types of policies really should be made by people who understand healthcare. So that's part of why I'm running. But I think that, I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but there are so many things that tie back to reproductive justice and reproductive decision making.
Thank you. And that's an
Mhm.
issue that you have been passionate about since 2011 when Ohio started debating about passing the first abortion laws. Can you tell us what triggered that transition for you?
It wasn't really triggering. There was no transition. It's, as I said, part of our training, part of our obstetric and gynecologic training includes doing abortion care. It's not a separate part of what we do. So to start seeing these laws, chipping away at our reproductive rights, and initially, it didn't start out with the heartbeat bill or anything like that. It started out more with why don't we restrict where abortions can be done or tell abortion clinics that they have to have contracts with hospitals or fetal remains had to be disposed of in a certain way. It was literally these little cuts, cuts by, what is it, death by 1,000 cuts? That's what abortion care, that's what happened in Ohio. The heartbeat bill, people have been trying to pass that since 2013. And every time it would die in committee. Finally, in 2019, it did pass because, again, there was such a push to get passed. But because of Roe v. Wade, it was not able to stand alone as a bill or stand alone as a law. And so they created what was a trigger ban. So if Roe v. Wade were down, then the heartbeat bill would become active in Ohio. And that's what happened on June 24th. Literally hours after that decision was overturned, Dave Yost went to the Ohio Supreme Court and said, okay, abortion's illegal. Now, technically, abortion is not illegal in Ohio. You can still get an abortion up to 6 weeks, but almost 80 to 90% of abortions happen after 8 weeks, but most of them happen in the first trimester. So not knowing if you're pregnant or not by 6 weeks is one of the challenges. Even if you do know, you have to go through a waiting period. You have to have an ultrasound. If there's a heartbeat, then, that makes it, then basically it's illegal in Ohio. So there are a lot of hurdles that people are having to jump. So it is easier. And again, it becomes more about money. So people of color, people that are minorities, people who don't have a lot of money, they're the ones who are then going to be impacted the most. So those who can travel, those who have access to care, those who have money can go to another state. So it perpetuates poverty, right? It perpetuates not being able to improve your position in life or your economic situation when whether your birth control fails, whether it's just not the right time, whatever the reason may be, getting pregnant and then not being able to choose whether to have the pregnancy or not. making that decision then forces you into potentially a life where you cannot climb out of poverty. And as you know, it's once one generation faces poverty, it's much more an issue for the next generation and the next generation. So we do need to recognize that overturning Roe v. Wade, you could look at it in a lot of these laws. When you think about some of the gun laws, the loosening of gun restrictions, the stand your ground laws are all part of racist policy. I as a physician organized, White Coats for Black Lives is a medical student organization that is fighting to minimize racism in the medical community. And we, after George Floyd, that became sort of a worldwide awakening to how people of color are treated differently by the cops, by police officers. We organized, a George Floyd moment of silence, 6 minutes, actually the time that he was being choked. But we also did the White Coats for Black Lives. We did those marches during COVID. COVID allowed for a lot of activism, in terms of being able to do some of the things to speak out. Columbus Medical Association, we were one of the first organizations to speak out about racism in medicine. Unfortunately, one of our esteemed representatives, one of the Senate members, is a physician who literally had the nerve to say, and I'm not going to repeat his name because it's not worth it, but he said this during COVID that, oh, do you think Black people are getting COVID more because they don't wash their hands? And it's like, oh my God, what a stupid thing to say. He lost his job over that. But again, he didn't lose his political position. He just lost his medical job. But, those are, when you look at racism in medicine, Black women are 3 times more likely to die in childbirth than Caucasians. And this is Ohio statistics. Same thing in terms of infant mortality. It's tragic when you think about oftentimes women's concerns are discounted, or their symptoms are overlooked, or their pain is inadequately treated. When you think back to, and it just hurts my heart to repeat these things, but when you go back and look in gynecology research, some of the biggest advances in gynecologic surgery has women slaves were operated on to be able to understand anatomy and to be able to understand how to do certain surgery. And, just that, that's such a classic example of racism, to assume that these women would tolerate pain or would give permission to have this type of surgery. Those things led to, several advances. It came to gynecologic surgery, and it's something that we need to reckon with. We need to live with, we need to understand that to move forward, and to understand the distrust that some communities have when it comes to doctors. And there's examples of this throughout history. Starting from slavery, but then the Tuskegee experiment, and with some African-American men with syphilis weren't treated because they wanted to see sort of what would happen if syphilis progressed. But, looking at currently, if we don't teach our medical students, if we don't teach our students in terms of public education how to critically think, how racism impacted our country in terms of, not just in medicine. You think about, economic generational economics, where if your family owns a home and they're able to pass that on to the next generation can then start at a higher economic level or socioeconomic status. So these are things that we need our next generation to understand. When you start chipping away and not teaching history adequately, not teaching the true history of racism or the true history of how America was founded. I think Michelle Obama even said, look at this White House, this amazing place was built on the backs of slaves. That is something that we need to understand. That is something that we need to really, just like Germany has really, really focused on making sure that the whole Nazi movement doesn't happen again, by keeping those monuments up, by showing, concentration camps, by talking about that history, by making sure that nobody ever falls into that trap again. But here we're hiding that history. I heard an interesting story about how, plantations have this romanticized, vision where, people have weddings and they have this romantic, you're like antebellum, the deep South in these plantations, but nobody looks at the sweat and tears and the families that were broken up because of the slaves maintaining those plantations. Nobody ever thinks about that. And I do think that that's something that as a politician, I would really want to make sure. Can't change the world. I can change my little corner of the world by looking at Ohio and looking at public education and, making sure that education is taught in such a fashion that everybody understands the full picture, not just the whitewashed picture of how America, started and what people contributed. When you think about what slaves contributed, when you think about the things that even women, like I've read some interesting books about women that were not given due credit for scientific experiments, women that, were behind the scenes, but did not get the credit that they deserved because men took credit for these things, So I think those are things as a politician that I would truly work on, is more funding for public education, more emphasis on not banning books, but on creating a history that addresses everybody, that kind of brings together how this country was founded. Somebody was talking about, oh, it's a white Christian, ethnic nation. I go, did you know there were Muslims in the United States prior to 1776? I go, Muslims were here in the literally the 1650s. Thomas Jefferson talked about it. So America was a multicultural, multi-religious country. It was founded with that, understanding. And we need to get back to people reading the Constitution, reading the Bill of Rights, knowing that is separation of church and state. There is this idea that, all religions should be supported equally. It's not just about, one religion being better than everybody else. And now I've gone off the deep end, not talking about Roe v. Wade anymore.
It's okay. So you believe that religion has a lot to do with overturning Roe v. Wade, which invariably will
I
affect
think
more
politics does.
population of color.
So I don't think religion has to do with overturning Roe v. Wade. I think politics does, because when you look at how did Roe v. Wade pass? It passed with a majority of votes, right? It wasn't that only Democrats voted for it or only Republicans voted for it. It was bipartisan. It became a religious thing because it was a concerted effort to create this idea that life begins with a heartbeat, that it is anti-religious. It is, just something that people who have religious values do not have abortions. So no, I don't think it was ever started as a or religious movement. I think it was politicians that pushed it to become a way to say, I'm religious and I have strong faith and strong values.
Yeah. And how have you seen how these, the overturning Roe v. Wade, have you seen the impact on some of your patients? Or how do you
Oh yeah,
think,
yeah,
can you,
absolutely. And it impacts everybody. It impacts you as a father. It impacts, the entire family. A recent example, when you look at, well, you're seeing them across the country. You're seeing examples of women that can't have surgery because they had a miscarriage, and the doctor is afraid that if they do that, then they'll be arrested, for performing an abortion. Um, for me, in terms of counseling patients, I've always counseled them about all options. If they're pregnant and they're undecided about the pregnancy, these are your choices. You can carry the pregnancy, you can have an abortion, or you can consider adoption. But the reality is only 10% of people actually, and this was again from the Turnaway study, that only 10% of women actually chose adoption. So the right wing talking point of adoption as a choice is not really true. Most people do not choose adoption when it comes down to being, sort of being in a point where they couldn't have the abortion. They don't choose to give that child up for adoption. They choose to raise that child with all of the expenses that come with that. So what was your original question? Sorry.
Do
Oh,
you, what are the mental impact of forcing people to have babies, by overturning Roe v. Wade?
yeah, so that also is something that was in that study looking at mental health. Most women who choose to have abortions are happy with their decision. It's very rare that someone regrets that decision. It's harder to do a study to say, hey, you have a child, or do you regret having that child? I think that the mental health part of it may come when you think about cases of abuse or neglect, or not being able to do what you want to do. So that leads to more cases of depression or postpartum depression, because you are now having or carrying a pregnancy that you didn't want to begin with. So that may be where we see mental health concerns. I think when I think about, mental health, and I mean, that's a big talking point, right? When we talk about mass shootings and gun violence, people always go back to mental health and go, oh, well, the shooter was crazy, or it was a mental health issue. But the reality of mental health is, think about how much more anxiety there is in the world today, because you don't know if you're going to go to church, or you're going to go to school, or you're going to go to a concert or a shopping mall or the grocery store, and you're going to get shot, right? I mean, every one of those examples, there has been a mass shooting in children. I mean, I talk to my friends' kids, they're teenagers. They have active shooter drills twice a month in their schools. That school is supposed to be a safe place. Kids should never have to do active shooter drills. That leads to that increased anxiety and mental health issues that come with anxiety. I mean, I don't know about you in Nigeria, but here when I was growing up, the most we had were tornado drills where you got under the desk. I mean, that was a drill. And during my kid's lifetime, Columbine happened in 1999, I believe, and then my kids graduated from high school in 2008 and 2010. They went to public schools, and over that period of time, we went from sort of all doors were open to slowly fewer and fewer doors were unlocked during the day. Then it became you could only go in through the main entrance, and then they started having metal detectors. So all that leads to mental health issues, all that sort of fear of guns. And there is nothing. Every single study in medicine and gun research shows that safer societies do not have more guns. More guns don't lead to safety. More guns actually lead to more shootings, and we're seeing that every day. It's sort of becoming this. You can turn on the news every single day and hear about a shooting. So more guns don't create more safety. Guns need to be. People need to have training. There are countries in the world that have maybe just as many guns per capita, not the total number of guns, but Switzerland is an example where people have to go through extensive training. They have to know how to lock up their guns and their, ammunition. And I may not even talk in the right terminology because I don't own a gun. I don't want to learn about guns. I understand the collateral damage of guns from being a physician, from seeing moms whose sons have died of gun violence, whose partners have been injured because somebody shot them over something stupid, So those are the things that I see that I worry about when it comes to mental health, and how do we keep our society safe? We're not keeping them safe by increasing the amount of guns that are out there. The stand your ground law It is so much about racism also. And I don't want to make this all about racism, but it is to, again, when you look at cases where, quote, someone, whether they're a majority white, or whatever, has shot a minority, it's very few and far between that those cases are, those people don't walk away. And it has to do with the stand your ground defense. I was worried about my safety, so I shot that person, even though that person's unarmed. It is just awful. And you and I can talk about this all day long, but we're headed down a path where we need to come to a realization that we all do better when we work together, and I think that right now, a lot of politicians are under the divide and conquer mentality. So when, there's violence against Asian groups that became even more prevalent during COVID because certain people were calling it the China virus, or the Wuhan virus, and that increased violence among the Asian American community. As communities, we need to think of ourselves all as one big community rather than, oh, that impacted just the Blacks over there and that impacted just the Asians over there, or that impacted a Hispanic community but not my community. Because when you divide and conquer, you then are able to continue to push a minority agenda. So this is another thing that I'm trying to figure out: how do we get communities to come together to understand that we all should be working together to overturn, like, get back to having state laws that codify abortion in the Constitution, that will help us to get better voting rights within Ohio. This pushing back to state rights was tried back in the after the civil rights. Same thing happened then. There was a big push to weaken the federal government and push, rights to the states so that the southern states could continue to have slavery, that they could continue to profit from people, getting poor wages. Because by then, of course, slavery was illegal. But I do think that, again, we as communities of color need to understand that we all need to work together. It's not just me advocating for Asian Americans. It's me advocating for all minorities, for all people of color.
Thank you. When and if you get elected to the House of Representatives, how do you think your presence there will make an impact when it comes to abortion rights, LGBTQ, gun rights, and things like that, knowing that the House is majority Republican?
Yeah, it is. So again, my experience as a physician, I can talk with authority about these things. Being a woman of color, I think, lends itself to knowing some of the things that people go through, but probably will also lead to some discounting. Oftentimes women are have to say things multiple times or have to get allies to say the same thing in order to be respected or to be understood that, yes, what you're suggesting is legitimately a good idea. I think that having an MD behind my name will allow for me to work with the Republicans on healthcare policy that may not be specifically abortion care, but maybe working more on getting contraception to not be overturned. Things like the personhood bill, which make no sense. To be able to explain that as a physician, this isn't real. You cannot have a personhood bill because it will impact people who go through in vitro fertilization. It will impact physicians who are offering families the ability, or offering infertile patients the ability to have a family. That now, what do you do with those embryos? In order to optimize success, you want genetically normal embryos, but then what do you do with the ones that are abnormal if we have a personhood bill? Is that doctor charged with murder? Is that person then, going to be charged also with murder because they, as a patient, said, yes, I want you to just those embryos not healthy? When you think about infertility care and the storage of embryos, what happens to those embryos? A lot of research is done with those discarded embryos, things that then lead to cancer cures, that lead to stem cell research. Well, stem cell research is using those embryos. So that's led to huge breakthroughs in cancer care, in transplants, So these are things that you as a, maybe as a lawyer, you understand it, but a lot of times people in the State House have no understanding of the science the technology, the science that we use with tissue that you think of as aborted fetuses, or the embryos that we're using, that the healthy ones are being used to create families, but the ones that are not healthy then can be used for research purposes.
Thank you. How do you feel as a doctor when you read about or hear all this misinformation about science and medicine?
I think that we've been dealing with it for a long time as physicians, because suddenly, if I can research on Google, I'm just as much of an expert as you are, right?
Google.
I can research law, and I can say, you know what? I don't know. Do you really know what you're talking about? I don't. My knowledge from Google must be equal to your degree. You studied for 3 years. You studied. You've been practicing for how many years? So that we so we've been dealing with that, and I always start the conversation with, I understand you probably did. And when I say research, I use that term loosely, because Googling things is not research. Research is actually reading the articles, reading the data, comparing the science, understanding the studies. But when someone says to me, "Well, I did my research," I'm like, I understand you went on Google, you looked up the top hits, but I said, we as doctors go on Google. We understand that there is a lot of vital, good information there, but you have to understand your sources. If you just take the top 3 sources, those may be the biggest hits of the day. They may have paid to be on the top of the list. So go to reputable sources if you're going to Google. Being an expert, I'm not an expert in law. I don't pretend to be an expert in law. And I think that the more you know, the more you read, the more you understand that you really don't know as much as you think you do. It's that idea of, the more knowledgeable you are about something, the more you recognize that you're not that knowledgeable. So I do think that that's where having a medical background, having a science background will help me to be able to say, with confidence that, no, this is not science. And I've done that at the State House. I've testified at the State House when, there were potential bills to reimplant ectopic pregnancies or give medications to reverse abortions. I was down there testifying, saying, this is not science. I'm an OBGYN. I've never been able to do either one of those things. You cannot make laws that require doctors to do things that don't happen in real life. So that's where I think that degree helped, and understanding that I don't know much about guns per se, but I'm willing to read about it. I'm willing to say, okay, what makes sense in terms of gun legislation? What would be reasonable that would keep our communities safe, but allow people to, if they want their guns for shooting, if they want to hunt, or, I don't know what else you do with guns. I really don't, but I don't know, you go to shooting ranges. I think like being able to read up on things that I have less of an understanding is going to help me be a better politician, a better representative for everybody in my district. And again, as a doctor, I'm not just, or a state representative, I'm not just representing, District 11. I'm representing the state of Ohio when it comes to things that involve healthcare, that involve education, because I believe in public education. I'm a product of public education. My kids are a product of that. I think that's super critical, to be able to support good public education, not just biased education where you're only allowed as a teacher to teach certain things.
Thank you. What do you want the people to remember about you when they want to decide who to vote for, either in the general election?
Right, right. It's a tough question. I think the most important thing to remember is that I truly believe that we can get back to, at least when it comes to healthcare policy, creating bipartisan legislation that we can work across the aisle with, no matter what community it is, no matter what political leaning the person has, being able to get them to understand that when you marginalize a community like LGBTQ plus or trans kids, you are marginalizing everybody in a sense. You're taking the smallest group and you are targeting them. I take care of LGBTQ plus. I do surgeries for trans males, so I know what those patients, what those folks go through. When I think about healthcare, I think about it. I don't ask my patients, "Are you Republican or Democrat?" I think I'm taking care of you because I want you to have a healthy life. So, in order to, think about me as a candidate, remember that I am looking to create a safer Ohio, a healthier Ohio, and like my slogan says, I'm delivering for the future. It's something that I really, really think is important that we create a state that is more progressive, that allows for all communities to thrive.
Thank you. And how can people reach you?
Dr. Somani for Ohio.com is the website, and Dr. Somani for the number 4 Ohio at gmail.com if they want to email directly. And then our Facebook site is Anita Somani, MD, and it's actually the number 4. And then Anita Somani, MD for Facebook, and Anita Somani, MD for Twitter. Yay! That's correct.
Thank you. No, thank you for coming onto Legal Angle to educate the community.
Thank you so much for giving me this platform to speak. And I apologize if I rambled too much, but it's always wonderful to talk about things that are dear to my heart.
Thank you. And what does it mean to you or for you to come on this show to talk to the community?
Just being able to have people recognize what's happening in Ohio, the gerrymandering, the importance of voting on August 2nd, understanding that the Supreme Court such a big role. So who you vote for, making sure you understand that there are 3 seats up for election. Again, on the Supreme Court, we have a son who did not recuse himself when all of these cases were going on, even though his father was the governor of the state. We need people at the Supreme Court that are unbiased, that are fair, that care about all of us. And so that's really critical. Don't stop at the top of the ballot. Vote down all the way down the ballot. Make sure that you know who your candidates are. Make sure you know who's running for the different courts. And you know that as a lawyer. I mean, you guys, the Bar Association rates people. But the Supreme Court, oftentimes now they're going to be allowed to say if they're Republican or Democrat. But in the past, it's always been nonpartisan. And unfortunately, our Supreme Court at the national level has shown their true colors. They are not being nonpartisan or deliberative about their decision making.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Legal Angle and for your time on this show. And for those of you who are watching us either on Facebook or YouTube or any other medium, thank you for joining us. And for those of you who are also listening to this as a podcast, we appreciate your time. Until next time, take care and stay blessed. Bye for now.